In this video, we'll talk about a game that I recently brought back from Japan called Houten 1905. This game is set up during the Russo-Japanese War that took place between 1904 and 1905 in Manchuria. The Russo-Japanese War is a crucial event to understand the imperialistic dynamic of Japan in the early 20th century. This conflict opposed the Russian Empire to the Empire of Japan, an empire in the process of developing its influence over East Asia. It was already more or less dominating Korea, and after the first Sino-Japanese War 10 years before, Japanese forces were already occupying parts of China. But with this conflict, it was the first time that the Japanese Empire was fighting a Western power and proved that their modernized army was a match for Westerners and provided a preview to what was to come 35 years later. This game focuses on the Battle of Mukden, the former capital of Manchuria, taking place in 1905, and that marked the end of the war. For the time, this battle was huge, the biggest of the conflict, and one of the largest land battles before World War I. It involved more than 500,000 soldiers and resulted in over 160,000 casualties, 25,000 of them killed in action over the course of 2 weeks and a half. The battle itself was only a tactical victory for Japan, but a major political and moral blow for Russia. Let's look at the components. As you can see, it's a very indie game coming in a mini Ziploc. The shop where I bought it only had 2 copies as a preview of the upcoming Tokyo Game Market that will come in late November 2018. Interestingly enough, you can see that the cards are already plastified, which is pretty nice, making it a good game while having a beer. The black and white artwork is pretty basic but enjoyable. Those cards are the core of the game and they enable the players to move their armies on the different fronts. I'll explain a bit more how it works later. You can see that there are 2 decks, one for the Russian and one for the Japanese player. And last but not least, the map. I'll make a bit of room to show you how it's set up. 1 card by side where you can see that there are 3 fronts, west, center and east. Each front has its own counter that will move north or south during the course of the game. Finally, there is 1-page rule, all in Japanese. But Board Game Geek got us covered on this one. If you look for Houten 1905, you'll find a page for the game. And in the file section there is an English translation for the game, approved by the developer. The rules are pretty well made with some visuals and a translation for each card. You will realize that the text on the cards are not that important. What really matters is the symbol on top of each of them. What it shows is that cards work this way. One of the cards moves the east front, one of the cards moves the west front, one of them the center, another one the 2 flanks at once, and finally a card that blocks your opponent's movement. So it's a pretty compact game, pretty simple. Looks like a very tiny CDG game as it has all of its core elements, a point-to-point map and card that drives players' action. So, how does it play? As it's mostly a bluffing game, I couldn't have a feel for it playing solo. To test the game, I needed to go to my Wargames buddy Place. He's also the perfect person to test it with, as he is himself in the process of designing a game on the Russo-Japanese War. A wargame that I hope to talk about soon on the channel, that also uses card as the core mechanic. Luckily enough, he doesn't live far, and we took the opportunity of our weekly gaming session to try Houten 1905. After reading the rules once, I had a good understanding of the mechanics and managed to explain them in about 5 minutes. Unfortunately, I did make a mistake for our first try, but as it plays fast, I would say around 15 minutes for a game, it wasn't that bad, and we could experiment the game properly a couple of times. It does require a few additional components provided by the player. 6 damage cubes, and 2 markers to track the battle status on the side of the map. Reading the rules, I would have thought that the game would be mostly about bluffing, but we soon understood that there indeed was some strategic depth to it. Not crazy strategic, but after a couple of rounds we could make some good assumptions about our opponent's future move and build a plan to counteract them. What it came to was finding a tight balance between preventing your opponent to get what he wants and pushing for what you need. This forces you to make some pretty interesting choices, and the game is way less random than I expected. Each round, the 2 players choose a sequence of 3 orders that are resolved simultaneously. While picking those orders, you must account for your military effort. So each card has some value, and those value on the cards express the intensity of the combat for your own troops. So there is this attrition management to it that is really interesting. Overall, you can win in 3 ways. Either you win by surrounding your opponent's army completely, so that's mostly happening on the map, or by having your opponent taking all 6 of the fatigue cubes that are on the side, or by holding positions in your opponent's territory for 6 rounds. So, now that we know this, we've played the game, is it a good game? Overall, Houten 1905 is more or less an advanced rock, paper, scissors with an historical theme and a strategic dimension. It's light rule-wise, but it had enough depth for us to have fun. There is one thing that we were both frustrated about. The theme was very light. Even if we didn't expect a simulation, we would have loved if a few historical elements impacted the gameplay. The mechanic as is could be applied to almost any battles just by changing the artwork. And we felt like it could have been slightly different. A bit of asymmetry, a light touch of historical flavor could have improved the game a lot without making it more complex. It could have conveyed a bit more history. Because why choose such an obscure event of the Japanese history and not give it more importance in the game? It's not like the Battle of Mukden is going to make the game more attractive to a wider audience. Actually, a more known battle could have done a better job. So why not give it more importance? Why not making the game convey more history? That is something that I don't really understand. Anyway, we had a lot of fun playing it, and it is definitely an excellent feeder. The mechanics are elegant, and the components surprisingly good for such an artisanal production. Actually, I think that with a more well-known theme and more professional components, it could also be a game to trick people into playing historical games, which is awesome and something that I'm always looking for. In fact, I definitely consider making one version myself on another battle. Finally, what I want to look into is how does this game is connected to the rest of the Japanese analog gaming culture. Unfortunately, I don't know much about the play culture in Japan. I'm a Go player myself. I have discovered some Japanese war games through MMP, such as A Victory Lost or Warriors of God, and I did play a few Japanese board games over the last couple of years. I really like On Games, for example. It's a company that gained some popularity recently in Europe, especially thanks to Deep Sea Adventures. And while I was in Japan, I also visited some board games cafe to see what was popular over there. What I can say is that Houten 1905 seems mostly reminiscent of the contemporary board game scene in Japan. A scene focusing on games with small footprints, involving bluff and strong social aspects, such as role-playing or hidden identities. I would definitely put this game in the same categories as games from Oink or Sachi and Sachi, like for example Dungeon of Mandom or Win the Film. Light, clever games revolving around card play and with smart mechanics that adds a bit of depth to a rather simple core rule set. But I feel like this game is also saying something about historiography in Japan. History is a very political thing, and political debates around Imperial Japan's history have been tense subjects in Japan and in the rest of Asia, especially in Korea and in China. For example, to this day, no official apology has been made to China for events such as the rape of Nanking, which is not an event for which there are discussions between scholars to agree on the fact that it was one of the most brutal crimes during the Second World War. Actually, even Iwane Matsui, the commander of the Japanese forces in China at the time, said a few months after the event, "My men have done something very wrong and extremely regrettable." Kind of an understatement, but still pretty revealing for Japanese general. Most Japanese war games don't really explore the history of Japan in the first half of the 20th century. When it comes to the Second World War, there is mostly a strong interest for the East Front. For reference, what I did is look at the 120 games published by Game Journal, one of the main publishers of Japanese war games. And on those 120 games, there is only 10 of them that cover events from the Japanese imperial era. So what I took is all games happening between the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and the end of the Second World War. When you look at this, you can see that in this context, a game like Houten 1905 that is supposed to be a light filler game is a real oddity, as even war games are not really looking into this specific period. Such a theme is highly unusual, making it a very interesting game to have in your collection, especially if you're a history buff. I would like to interview some Japanese wargame designer about their interest on this era and the reception of wargames on those subjects domestically. Let me know in the comment section if you would be interested by such interviews and for me to do a video specifically on this topic. That's it for now. Thanks for watching Homo Ludens and see you next time.